This seat doesn't belong to you. 4 words, sharp as a blade, sliced through the stillness of the first-class cabin on a quiet morning flight. No one spoke, no one moved. The speaker stood upright, face expressionless and cold. The listener was a slender black teenager silently reading a book. Owen Walker, 17 years old, a senior at one of the South Bronx's most prestigious high schools, had just come out of the National Scholarship exams. He had been accepted into a coveted summer program at Stanford, not by luck, but through sheer grit. His parents had passed away early. Owen lived with his grandmother, a retired teacher, who always told him, "You may not have been born into a fair world, but you can choose how you rise in it." Today, Owen chose to rise by sitting down. It was early morning at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. The sky was still misty. Suitcases rolled quickly through the automatic glass doors. The click-clack of heels, the boarding announcements echoing overhead, all merged into a bustling symphony, completely unfamiliar to Owen. This was his very first time in a first-class cabin, a place he had only seen through a television screen for years. He wasn't flying for vacation, not for business either. This flight was a reward he gave himself after relentless studying and non-stop shifts at the bookstore down the street. With enough savings to buy a first-class seat, Owen had deliberated for weeks. He could have kept the money. But then his grandmother said something that changed everything. "You're not buying a first-class seat. You're buying the right to be treated like everyone else, and you deserve that." He wore a clean white shirt, a simple black jacket, and had his hair neatly braided back, modest but presentable. From the moment he stepped into the first-class lounge, Owen felt the stares. Some glanced and looked away. Others pretended to be busy. No one smiled. At gate 28A, Madeline Parks, the lead flight attendant, stood tall, adjusting her red neck scarf like a sacred ritual. With over 12 years in the industry, she prided herself on being strict and by the book in her service. When Owen handed over his e-ticket, Madeline's eyes lingered longer than necessary, a faint furrow of her brow. She scanned him from head to toe as if measuring his suitability. "Are you sure this is the correct ticket?" Her tone was light, but edged with doubt. Owen smiled politely and offered the QR code. It scanned. Seat 2A, first class window side. No mistakes. Not a single letter off. Madeline nodded reluctantly, but her eyes said clearly, "We'll be speaking again." As Owen entered the first-class cabin, he drew in a deep breath. Premium leather seats, crisp white pillows, and a glass of orange juice waiting by the armrest. Everything looked like a dream. The passengers around him, middle-aged businessmen, a woman in Cartier glasses, a young Korean family, glanced at him like an alien intruding in a sacred zone. But Owen didn't care. He pulled out his book, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and dove into the opening lines. That's how he had always survived. Reading. Reading to understand that this history wasn't new, that he wasn't the first to be questioned just for the color of his skin, or for daring to sit where he wasn't supposed to. 7:01 a.m. The cabin door closed. A soft ding signaled final preparations for takeoff. Just as Owen settled in, he heard it, the sharp sound of heels tapping with authority down the aisle. Madeline was coming. She stopped at his row. Her smile had disappeared. "You need to double-check your ticket. It seems you're in the wrong seat." Owen handed her his phone politely. "I don't believe I'm mistaken. You can check again, seat 2A. Madeline glanced at the screen. Everything was correct, but she stepped back and subtly signaled to the security guard behind her. What happened next felt like a scene in slow motion. A white man in a TSA uniform, broad-shouldered, stern-faced, stepped into the first-class cabin. No questions, no ID check, just stand up. This seat isn't for you." "But I bought this ticket," Owen replied calmly, still seated, gripping his book tightly. "Don't you understand? Get up, now." Owen looked around at the passengers. No one said a word. A man behind his newspaper lowered his head. The woman in Cartier glasses pulled her mask higher over her face. Owen stood, but he didn't leave. "Can you please call the flight manager? I haven't done anything wrong." The guard stepped closer, voice firm. "No more talking. If you don't move, you'll be removed from this flight." Silence. It was the longest moment in Owen's life. No one defended him. No one intervened. Not a single soul. He turned to Madeline. Their eyes locked. "You don't think I belong here, do you?" Madeline didn't answer. She just looked away. If you believe fairness should never depend on skin color or seat number, tap like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to follow the next chapter. This story has only just begun. Outside, the sun had risen high, casting warm rays of light through the airport's glass windows. But inside Mayra, a quiet chill was creeping in. She sat alone on the cold metal bench in the security screening area, her hands tightly clasped together. The Landon High School uniform she wore was rumpled from the scuffle moments earlier. Her ankle burned from being dragged across the carpet, and her mind was a storm of chaos, like a hurricane had just torn through her. Why is this happening to me? The question echoed in her head, over and over again like a painful whisper. Mayra didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, silent. And yet, it was that very silence that echoed the loudest. A security officer named Hank, the man who had just pulled her from the first-class seat, stood a few feet away. He spoke into his walkie-talkie while glancing at her occasionally with suspicion, as if she were a potential threat. "We need to verify this girl's identity. Use her ID and the surveillance cameras to check for unauthorized access," Hank said in a clipped, cold tone, without the faintest hint of remorse. Mayra heard every word. Each one landed like another blade cutting into her dignity. She didn't need to hear more to understand. They didn't believe her. Just because she was a girl of color sitting in first class, they had already decided she didn't belong there. Meanwhile, upstairs in the airport, her grandfather, Dr. Emmanuel Green, was rushing through the terminal, ignoring the calls of his assistant and airport staff behind him. His silver hair fluttered as he moved, his shirt damp with sweat, but he didn't stop. "Where is my granddaughter?" he shouted, his voice tight with fear. "I've asked 3 times who took her off the plane and for what reason." His assistant trembled as she held her phone, trying to reach the security department, but no one was answering. The others around them stood awkwardly, eyes darting nervously as they began to realize. This was not an ordinary old man. Dr. Emmanuel Green was one of the nation's most esteemed scientists, once invited to address Congress and a strategic advisor to 2 U.S. presidents. But at this moment, he wasn't a national icon. He was a grandfather, burning with anguish for a granddaughter who had just been publicly humiliated. Back in the screening area, another airport employee approached Mayra. She was a black woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that somehow held a glint of regret. Her name tag read Tasha. Tasha knelt slightly and handed Mayra a bottle of water, whispering, "Are you okay?" Mayra didn't respond. She only nodded slightly. "I'm sorry this happened," Tasha said softly, almost as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "I saw you from the start. You didn't do anything wrong." A faint warmth seeped through Mayra's shame, but with it came a wave of resentment. If she knew I was innocent, why didn't she step in? Why did everyone stay silent while I was dragged away like a criminal? Tasha seemed to read her thoughts. "I know. Sometimes silence is the only way to survive in the system," she said quietly. "But I don't think I can stay silent anymore." In the high-level operations room, a screen displayed footage of Mayra being removed from her seat. Standing in front of it was a sharply dressed man wearing a name badge. Maxwell Hart, Vice President of Skylux Airlines. Maxwell stood with arms crossed, thoughtful. He wasn't new to crises. But as the video replayed and froze on the frame where Mayra looked up with eyes full of wounded dignity, he felt something shift inside him. "Call legal," Maxwell said to his assistant, "and prep an emergency incident report. We may have just made a very serious mistake." At the same time, a question was circulating in the minds of viewers everywhere. How could a young girl sit in first class with such calm if she didn't have a legitimate reason to be there? That very question is what will take the audience deeper into what comes next, where the truth begins to unravel and layers of prejudice are peeled back one by one. What do you think happened? Why was Mayra in first class? And will she let this public humiliation go unanswered? The atmosphere in the business class cabin seemed calm, but in reality it was brimming with silent lightning. The image of Amelia, the middle-aged woman who had just been removed from her first-class seat, still lingered in Miles' mind like a ghost not yet laid to rest. Her eyes hadn't begged. They hadn't accused. They were simply silent, but as heavy as lead. And it was that silence that made it impossible for him to shake the feeling that something had veered off the path of justice. Inside the cabin, the click of high heels, those of Chief Flight Attendant Celeste, grew more piercing by the second. She strutted down the aisle as though it were the runway of a luxury airline, each glance filled with disdain for those she deemed unfit for this space. Miles turned to look out the window. Thin layers of clouds drifted past the aircraft wing like rivers flowing through a different timeline, a world without judgmental stares, without soft-spoken insults disguised as etiquette. But just then a young girl's whisper came from the row behind. "Daddy, why did they make that lady leave her seat? She didn't do anything wrong." That voice, as light as air, struck Miles like a bell tolling inside his chest. He turned. The girl looked to be no more than 6, with curly hair and large, innocent eyes, waiting for an adult answer that made sense. Her father, a polished white businessman, looked flustered, avoiding her gaze, trying to sidestep the question. No one replied, but the entire cabin had heard. And in that silence a strange feeling spread, a kind of quiet shame like the sting of conscience too heavy to name. In seat 4C, a woman around 50 named Rosa Gutierrez gripped the hand of her fiancé, Malcolm, a black man. Rosa was no stranger to the sting of discrimination. A Latina nurse during the pandemic, she had been called cruel names simply because of her Mexican accent. And today, witnessing a black woman removed from her seat under the presumption that she couldn't possibly hold a valid ticket, Rosa felt her old scars begin to bleed again. "Did you see that, Malcolm? They haven't changed. After all these years." Malcolm nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the cockpit, the place where decisions affecting hundreds of lives were made, sometimes based on nothing more than a fleeting glance. Behind that cockpit door, Captain Lyman was reviewing the flight itinerary. A white man, former military pilot, now flying commercial, to provide stability for his family. He hadn't heard about what happened in business class until Priya, the first officer of Indian descent, entered with a tense expression. "Do you know what just happened?" she said. "They kicked a black woman out of seat 2A because they didn't believe she had a first-class ticket. But according to our system, she's a VIP, booked 2 months ago." Lyman frowned. "Was it Celeste who handled it?" Priya nodded. Lyman sighed, wiping his face with visible heaviness. Not from surprise, but from disappointment. This wasn't the first time. He had heard of things like this happening before, but no one wanted to raise the issue for fear of rocking the boat, for fear of compromising the airline's professional image. "We can't let this slide like nothing happened. I'll file a report with headquarters after we land." We should do more than that, Priya replied, because if today it's her, tomorrow it could be me. At the Skyworld Airlines data basement, where booking records and flight logs were stored, an IT staffer named Aiden Chen had just spotted something suspicious. The booking data for a passenger named Amelia Robinson had been altered just 12 minutes before departure. He squinted at the screen. The IP address that made the changes was from the internal network, not an external breach. The most recent login, Celeste D. Rowan, the very same chief flight attendant on the flight. Aiden couldn't just sit on this. He didn't hold the authority to make executive calls, but he knew one thing. If no one speaks up, the truth will be buried, like so many other cases lost in the cracks of the system. He downloaded the full log of the edits, attached screenshots, and quietly sent an email to a single destination. internal.whistleblower@skyworldair.com, the internal ethics hotline created to uphold transparency. Back in the business class cabin, Miles unlocked his phone and double-checked. He still had the digital receipt that Amelia, the black woman, had handed him before she left. A legitimate ticket, paid in full a month in advance. Her name matched the reservation, which meant she'd been wrongfully removed. Not just unfairly, but unlawfully. Miles wasn't a civil rights activist. He was a journalist, but sometimes silence meant complicity. He opened his notes app and typed the first line. Today I watched a woman erased from the cabin of business class, not because she broke a rule, but because of a baseless suspicion by those in uniform. And in that moment I realized, discrimination doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just takes a single glance laced with prejudice, and a quiet keystroke that deletes your existence from the system. The air inside the cabin was thick, not from a lack of oxygen, but from a rising sense of injustice spreading like invisible smoke. Passengers whispered among themselves, exchanging confused, uneasy glances. Some looked openly upset. They had just witnessed something almost surreal. A young woman dragged from her first-class seat as if she were a fraud rather than a legitimate passenger. And yet, strangely, she had not screamed. She hadn't resisted. There were only her eyes, calm and piercing, as if they carried an entire unwritten chapter of history. Lyra had not cried. Though her heart ached with every beat, she refused to let tears fall, not out of pride, but because she knew. As a young woman of color, tears rarely made people pause. Only calm, resolve, and intelligence could shake the walls of prejudice. Who do you think you are, sitting in that seat? The words of Chief Flight Attendant Sheila still echoed in her mind. Every eye in the cabin had turned toward Sheila, a middle-aged white woman with sharp makeup and sharper words, now visibly rattled. She kept darting glances around the cabin, whispering frantically with the crew, clearly sensing something had gone wrong. In the economy section, Lyra was now seated beside a brown-skinned middle-aged man in a corporate suit and thick-rimmed glasses. At first he had simply nodded a polite greeting, but a few minutes later he leaned in and quietly asked, "I'm sorry, that was difficult to watch. Are you all right?" Lyra gave a faint smile, answering softly, "Thank you. I'm okay. But this isn't the first time." The man nodded, his eyes filled with quiet empathy. "I'm a civil rights attorney. If you need help, I'm here." The words struck deep, not because she needed a lawyer, but because for the first time since the chaos began, someone had looked at her as a human being, not as a threat, not as a scammer, not as something that doesn't fit. At the airline's operations center in Chicago, phones began ringing incessantly. "We have a situation," a supervisor said, rushing into the office of Milton Graves, the airline's deputy director of operations. "What's going on?" Milton asked, glancing up from his screen. "A VIP passenger was just removed from her first-class seat on Flight 808. There was a glitch in the ID verification system. But the issue isn't just the system error, it's who she is. Milton frowned. Be specific. The supervisor handed over a printed passenger profile. As Milton read the name, his eyes widened. Lyra Stanton. A silence froze the entire room. Stanton? Which Stanton? The youngest daughter of Elijah Stanton, our newest strategic investor. He's preparing to inject over $1.2 billion into our airline's restructuring. Milton shot to his feet. Oh, God. Tell me this is a mistake. The supervisor swallowed hard. No, sir. And it's starting to spread online. A passenger live-streamed the incident. The hashtag number sign, first class. While black is trending, a cold shiver ran down Milton's spine. In the airline industry, nothing is more dangerous than the collision of racial scandal and the internet. And if the woman involved was the daughter of a key investor, this wasn't just a PR issue. It was a full-scale threat to the airline's future. Back on board, no one knew that an earthquake was beginning to ripple through the airline's leadership. But Lyra sat still, her gaze fixed on the window. Inside, however, her mind was moving. Not with anger, but clarity. She knew now this wasn't just her story. Quietly, she unlocked her phone and typed a simple message to her father. Dad, they just pulled me from seat 1A. No questions. No explanation. I don't want to make a scene, but I can't stay silent anymore. Less than 30 seconds later, a reply came through. I'll handle this. Stay calm. It's time we make them confront themselves. Lyra exhaled deeply. She leaned back in her seat, not in pain, but with a sense of readiness. At the Skyworld Airlines headquarters in New York, CEO Anthony Kessler had just been called into an emergency meeting. You need to see this, his assistant said, handing him an iPad. A clip from Flight 808 was already playing, Lyra being escorted out. Her face composed, but her eyes commanding silence. Who is that girl? Lyra Stanton, sir, and we have a press conference with Mr. Elijah Stanton scheduled for tomorrow morning. Anthony stood up immediately. Suspend every flight with that flight attendant, Sheila Foster. Call media relations, and bring me a full audit on how we handle VIP and sensitive profile passengers. A decision was taking shape, and it would rattle a system long used to operating on professional intuition, a euphemism too often covering bias. Meanwhile, the attorney seated beside Lyra suddenly received a phone call. Yes. I understand. I'll make sure she's all right. She's right next to me. Lyra looked at him, tilting her head slightly. Who was that? He smiled gently, tapping his jacket pocket like he was holding on to something weighty. An old acquaintance, someone very influential. It seems you're about to become the catalyst for a reckoning in this industry. Ms. Lyra said nothing at first. But for the first time since boarding the plane, she turned to him, eyes gleaming. Then it's time we make them listen. The dark gray SUV sped through suburban streets toward the outskirts, where the Amara's villa stood nestled behind thick rows of trees. Inside the car, Raymond, Amara's husband, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes weighed down by thought. The entire ride had been silent. Their two daughters, Olivia and Samira, didn't fully understand what was happening, only that the air inside the car was dense, stifling, almost too heavy to breathe. Amara sat in the back, phone in hand, the glow from the screen casting sharp shadows across her resolute face. A woman holding herself together just enough not to fall apart. She had just received an anonymous text message. What Claire knows about 1998 could destroy you. No context, no sender. But that single chilling line cut through Amara's memory like a razor, making it impossible for her to sit still. CTA 1. If you've ever believed that buried secrets never resurface, leave a comment. This story may make you think again. Don't forget to hit like if you feel the weight of silence. And subscribe to this channel so you won't miss what comes next, because what's coming will take your breath away. The memory of 1998, 2 decades ago, was something Amara had spent her life avoiding. It wasn't just a hard year. It was the pivot point, the shadowed intersection where fate turned. She was just 22 then, an intern at Horizon Airlines, working under the Vice President of Operations, Mr. Clyde Ramsey. Claire Ramsey, at that time, had only just graduated from college, but had already become the darling of the executive team, and more importantly, Clyde's precious daughter. That night, during a late shift when most of the office had emptied, Amara had witnessed something she could never forget. Claire had ordered around a young Haitian flight attendant named Leanne, treating her like a servant. She yelled, insulted, and eventually slapped Leanne for dropping her luxury handbag. Amara hadn't intervened, not because she agreed, but because she knew that speaking up would mean losing everything. A few days later, Leanne left Horizon quietly. No complaint, no report. Amara had convinced herself over the years that it wasn't her fault, but deep down she knew she had failed. She hadn't stood up. She had chosen silence, and Claire knew it. That evening at the villa, after Raymond tucked the girls into bed, Amara sat alone on the back porch. Garden lights twinkled around her as her face wrestled with the weight of the past. She dialed an old number, Leanne's, but only the cold voice of the automated message answered, "The number you have dialed is not in service." Stillness. Then Amara stood abruptly. She went to the garage and pulled out an old laptop, plugging in a dusty external hard drive, one she hadn't touched in years. In a folder labeled Crew Records, 1998, she began scanning the list of former employees. And there it was. Leanne Duverger, born 1976, Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Moved to New York in 1995. Worked at Horizon for only 3 months before leaving, no reason stated. But what stunned Amara was the final note on the file. Restricted access. Legal department flagged. Do not alter. Flagged by legal? Why? Amara whispered. She tried to access the detailed file, but was blocked by an internal firewall. A long pause, a moment frozen in time. She realized then, Leanne didn't leave. She was silenced, and the person behind it could only be Clyde, possibly Claire too. The next morning, Amara arrived at Horizon headquarters early, but instead of heading to the executive floor, she descended into the building's archival basement, the vault of old records. There, she met a familiar face. Marcus Halverson, a longtime records clerk who had worked at Horizon for nearly 40 years. He had once been a quiet ally to her as a young intern. "Marcus," she said softly, "I need to review the internal file on Leanne Duverger's resignation in 1998. You remember her, don't you?" Marcus hesitated. "The Haitian girl. I do. But are you sure you want to dig that up?" Amara met his eyes, unwavering. "It's not about want. It's about need." After a long silence, Marcus led her to a separate aisle, pulling out a red-labeled box. Employee incident. Confidential. Amara flipped through the documents, meeting notes, typed letters, and then a handwritten note from Leanne. "I was humiliated, slapped, and degraded. But when I tried to speak, I was told I'd never work again if I did. They said no one would believe a girl like me." Beneath it was a signature. Not Leanne's, Claire Ramsey's, marked as "Witness, no misconduct found." Amara stood frozen. She felt the blood drain from her body. Claire had covered it up. Worse, Amara realized she had been the silent witness who allowed it to happen. By 4 p.m., Amara left headquarters without returning to the boardroom. She walked straight to a small coffee shop near the central station, a place Leanne had once said she visited when homesick. The shop was still there. But the staff had changed. Amara left her business card and asked them to call if anyone ever mentioned Leanne. As she stood to leave, an older woman approached her. "Excuse me, are you looking for Leanne Duverger?" Amara turned around. "Yes. Do you know her?" The woman nodded. "I'm her aunt. She doesn't live here anymore, but she's still in New York. I can take you to her, but only if you have a good reason. After what happened, Leanne doesn't trust easily." What do you think will happen when Amara finally confronts the past she once stayed silent about? Leave your thoughts below. Hit like if you believe justice should come to light. And subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because next time the truth won't have anywhere left to hide. The top floor of Skyline's headquarters in New York glowed under soft amber light. Inside the glass-walled office overlooking the city at night, Marcus Washington stood silently by the window. The usual confidence in his eyes had faded, replaced by a contemplative stillness. Since the incident with Elijah, an 8-year-old black passenger removed from first class by flight attendant Ruby Marsh, Skyline had found itself caught in an invisible storm, and Marcus, the very founder of the company, was now confronting something he had never anticipated: doubt from within the very system he believed he had mastered. The phone on his desk buzzed. It was a call from Monique Dawson, Skyline's chief legal officer, once his star student at Harvard Law, and now the only person who still dared to speak the truth. "Marcus," Monique's voice came through, firm and clear, "an internal report has been leaked. It's not just Ruby's incident. We have at least 14 similar cases over the past 3 years, all involving racially biased treatment toward black passengers." A long silence followed. Marcus clenched his fists, the knuckles white. He had always believed in professional standards, in the rigor of his training system. But now, that professionalism he thought was a fortress was crumbling from within. Elsewhere, in a modest apartment in the Bronx, Mrs. Laverne Bradley, Skyline's first black flight attendant, back in the 1980s, quietly placed her tea on the table. The news about young Elijah had left her sleepless for days. She wasn't one for social media, but this time she decided to write a handwritten letter addressed directly to Marcus. "Dear Marcus, I once believed Skyline was our beacon of hope. But after what happened, I see now I was wrong. I feel as if I left behind an unfinished legacy. And you are now surrounded by well-dressed suits with hollow hearts." That letter was personally delivered to Marcus by Monique, an act that required no words, only the weight of generational disappointment. The next morning, Marcus called for an emergency meeting with the executive board. In the expansive glass conference room where daylight poured in and every word echoed, he walked in, no tie, no rehearsed speech. "No PR, no lawyers," he began. "I'm going to ask one question. Who here believes Elijah didn't deserve to sit in first class?" Silence, then a voice. It was Todd Renshaw, the VP of Operations, known for his dismissive attitude toward diversity efforts. "I don't care what color the kid is. All I know is, the flight attendant saw a boy traveling alone, no parents around, looked like a stray." Marcus squinted. "Thank you. That's all I needed to know to see where the real problem lies." At the same time, in a small office across the campus, Ruby Marsh sat staring at a half-written incident report. She had been suspended indefinitely and was now trying to justify her actions, saying she followed protocol, that the boy lacked documentation proving he was accompanied by a legal guardian. But deep inside, something began to crack. She remembered Elijah's eyes. He didn't cry, didn't fight back. He just looked her straight in the eye with a silence that unnerved her. It wasn't fear. It was the gaze of someone who had already been judged too many times in his young life. Ruby felt uneasy. For the first time she began to realize the professionalism she took pride in had become a shield to avoid moral accountability. That night, Marcus made an unexpected visit to the home of Camille, Elijah's mother. She was a pediatrician working the night shift at the city hospital. He brought a handwritten letter of apology and a promise. "I can't change what happened, but I will make sure it doesn't happen again. No black child should ever be told they're not up to standard. Elijah deserves the best, not some outdated definition of worthiness." Camille was silent. Then she slowly nodded. 1 week later, Skyline launched the Passenger Justice Commission, co-chaired by Marcus and Monique, with advisory input from Mrs. Laverne Bradley and a panel of independent civil rights advocates. This wasn't a PR stunt. It was a structural rebuild, from the ground up. At the official announcement, Marcus stood before hundreds of flashing cameras, and for the first time he publicly admitted the company's failure. "We've been proud of our engineering, proud of our customer service, but perhaps we forgot the most fundamental thing: human dignity." Elijah wasn't just a passenger. He was a wake-up call, and today I thank him for teaching us a lesson this entire industry needs to relearn. Applause erupted, not because he was a CEO, but because he owned the truth and finally began to make it right. Early Wednesday morning, Skyline headquarters entered another tense day of meetings. The media still swarmed the main entrance, and every look, every headline felt like a dagger aimed at the airline once hailed as a global model. But what no one knew was that a new earthquake was silently forming beneath the surface. In a small town 4 hours from New York, inside a cramped room of a nursing home, a 73-year-old woman named Dorothy Evans carefully folded a stack of worn documents. Once the former head of human resources for Skyline's Northeast Division in the 1990s, she had been known as the quiet architect behind the recruitment and training of senior flight crews. That morning, when she saw the news about Elijah, the young black boy discriminated against in first class, Dorothy cried. Not out of surprise, but because it reopened a wound she had spent years trying to bury. Dorothy had been forced into early retirement after submitting an internal report exposing systemic racial bias in the recruitment of flight attendants. She had known the truth. Many black applicants were rejected not due to lack of qualifications, but because they didn't fit the brand image. Back then, company leadership swept everything under the rug. She was retired with a silent payout. And all of it was hidden beneath a polished media narrative. But now, seeing Elijah, an innocent child humiliated for his skin color, Dorothy knew she could no longer stay silent. At Skyline's corporate offices, Marcus Washington received a strange anonymous email with only one subject line. "You must see this before it's too late." Attached were 16 scanned documents, all internal records from 1992 to 2001. It was Dorothy's buried report, complete with handwritten notes, meeting minutes, employee lists, and a roster of black applicants deliberately rejected under upper-level orders. Marcus read it in silence. The air in his office turned still and heavy. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a decades-long pattern of institutional failure. And worst of all, some current senior executives were very likely involved. That same afternoon, Marcus did something unprecedented. He announced a full independent investigation with third-party oversight, led by Dr. Clarice Monroe, a black civil rights attorney, former federal prosecutor, and a renowned figure who had dismantled systemic racism within the private prison industry. Clarice didn't say much when she entered Skyline headquarters, but her eyes scanned the room of executives as though she already knew what they had tried to hide. "I'm not here to save reputations," she said. "I'm here to make sure children like Elijah are no longer treated like afterthoughts." Meanwhile, Ruby Marsh was spending the quietest days of her life. She had retreated to her hometown to escape the media storm. But silence didn't bring peace. Something inside her had begun to shift. When she first heard about the independent investigation, she exhaled. Though she was the one who removed Elijah from his seat, deep down, she knew the wrong wasn't solely hers. It stemmed from a cold, mechanical training system, from a workplace culture that taught her passengers who didn't fit the mold were a liability. She began writing a letter, not to justify herself, but to speak the truth. I was the one who told Elijah to leave his seat, I won't deny it, but I was also a victim. I saw 2 of my black colleagues denied promotions for reasons no one put in writing. We have to tell the truth. If we don't, Skyline will always remain a machine built to repeat its failures. 2 weeks later, Clarice Monroe released her first preliminary report. The aviation industry trembled. The 78-page document listed 47 severe cases of racial discrimination, ranging from systematically denying black flight attendants leadership roles to fabricated reasons for asking black passengers to change seats. Some incidents had occurred within the past year. What stood out? The report included anonymous testimony from Ruby Marsh, along with documented evidence from Dorothy Evans and 2 former senior managers. On the final page, Marcus read the closing statement aloud. An airline may lift people into the sky, but that means nothing if it drags human dignity to the ground. The emotional climax of this chapter came in a video that went viral nationwide, footage taken secretly by a passenger on Elijah's flight. It captured the exact moment when the 8-year-old boy was asked by Ruby to leave his seat. He didn't resist. He simply zipped up his small backpack and whispered, "I was just trying to sit where my mom told me to." The video ended with the voice of a nearby woman, sighing, "Poor child." He did nothing wrong. Social media exploded. The hashtag number, "Let Elijah Sit," became a national symbol of the fight against racial bias in service industries. The atmosphere inside Skyline headquarters had grown increasingly stifling. Clarice Monroe's investigation had begun to unearth dark corners that had remained untouched for more than 3 decades. Gone were the usual hallway laughs and casual banter. In their place were caution, fear, and above all, shame. A silent tidal wave was building inside the organization. At the Human Resources Training Department, once the fortress of so-called brand image consistency, a group of younger employees had quietly organized a discussion session titled, "Listening Without Judgment, Stories Never Told." The first session had only 12 attendees. By the 3rd day, over 100 current and former staff had joined, flight attendants, trainers, and ground crew. They didn't talk about Elijah. They talked about themselves, being reprimanded for having too curly hair, rejected for unflattering uniforms, or denied opportunities in the premium cabin simply for being of Asian or African descent. In one long pause, Sanjay Kapoor, an Indian staff member, teared up as he shared, "In 2017, I almost lost my job for helping a black passenger switch to a more comfortable seat. My supervisor told me I was too lenient with people who don't respect the rules. I never stepped in again." No one replied, but the tears and heavy gazes said enough. Decades of silence were finally beginning to crack like rotting paint. Then came the internal bombshell. George Halverson, a longtime board member and head of customer service operations for over 15 years, resigned immediately after receiving a subpoena from Clarice Monroe. George had been one of the primary architects of the flight attendant training policies in the 2000s. Internally, he was known as Skyline's brand guardian. But among the materials submitted by Dorothy Evans was a damning email sent by George himself. First-class passengers expect a premium experience. The appearance of the service staff is a critical part. Avoid placing hard-to-assimilate personnel in the premium cabin. When that email surfaced in the media, George quietly submitted his resignation. But that night Marcus received a call from George's private attorney. A veiled threat was delivered. He's willing to name others involved if Skyline keeps pushing this too far. Marcus froze. This was no longer just about a child being forced from his seat. This was a power structure that had learned how to protect itself through silence, backroom deals, and calculated optics. Meanwhile, Ruby Marsh, once the center of the firestorm, returned to headquarters voluntarily. She requested a meeting with Clarice Monroe. When she entered the room, Ruby no longer looked like the timid flight attendant from before. Her face bore the exhaustion of recent weeks, but her eyes were steadier than ever. I'm not here to defend myself. I just want to say, I was trained to believe that children like Elijah were exception cases. Cases to be handled carefully, and sometimes pushed away if necessary. I didn't realize it was racism. I grew up in a system that never gave me the right to question it. Clarice was silent. Then she placed her hand on the file before her. You weren't the mastermind, but you are the clearest evidence of a misprogrammed generation of employees. The real question is, what will you do next? Ruby nodded. I want to testify. Publicly. No anonymity. No face covered. The next morning, Ruby stood at a press conference hosted by Clarice Monroe. She stepped up to the podium, hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. I was the one who asked Elijah to leave his first-class seat. I was the one who hurt that child. But I'm here today to say I will no longer be part of the lie. I apologize to his family, to the black community, and to anyone who has ever been silenced the way I once was. There was a moment of silence in the room. Then applause erupted, not out of forgiveness, but for the courage to confront the truth. That night, Marcus appeared live on the national program Voices of America. He announced a sweeping reform plan, including appointing Clarice Monroe as Skyline's independent human rights supervisor, a complete overhaul of recruitment and training protocols founded on transparency, equity, and cultural representation, and most symbolically, the launch of a permanent public initiative titled Elijah's Seat, the Empty Chair, that changed everything. From now on, one first-class seat would remain unoccupied on every domestic flight, a solemn reminder of justice interrupted. The internet exploded with emotion. Across platforms, the hashtags number Elijah's Seat and number Ruby Spoke Up swept through communities. Employees from across the service industry began to share their own stories of hidden discrimination, marking the beginning of a national movement to reform the ethical fabric of customer service. On a gloomy March morning, just as the atmosphere at the Skyline Airlines headquarters was beginning to warm up following Marcus's wave of reforms, an anonymous internal message ignited a new fire, a leaked document titled Training. Recording first-class priority, categorizing passengers by psychological and behavioral profiles. The content was a 17-minute audio clip in which the voice of a senior training department manager, believed to be Amanda Fairchild, a once prominent figure and former special advisor to George Halverson before his resignation, could be heard. In the recording, the woman said, "First class isn't just a ticket, it's a symbol. We can't let that symbol get diluted. Passengers need to see a consistent image, clean, bright, and agreeable. No one says it out loud, but we all know what that means." She paused for a few seconds, then chuckled lightly. "It may not sound politically correct, but that's how we retain our VIP customers." The media exploded. Major news outlets like CNN, MSNBC, and even FOXNEWS simultaneously reported the story. A wave of backlash against Skyline Airlines spread, not from equality advocates, but from the far right. They launched the hashtag #sign Skyline Witch Hunt, claiming Marcus and his team were engaging in reverse discrimination. turning a single incident into an excuse to destroy American corporate culture. A former shareholder named Jonathan Rees, previously removed from the board by Marcus due to racist remarks, suddenly re-emerged. In an exclusive interview on a conservative channel, he stated, "Skyline is losing its longtime customer base just to appease a small group. It's a mistake to let a child and a woke CEO ruin a brand we spent decades building." At Skyline's headquarters, Marcus walked into an emergency meeting. The faces in the room were tight with tension. Clarice Monroe presented the latest report. 42 flights canceled due to internal protests. 3 pilots resigned, citing no longer feeling protected. First quarter revenue could drop by 11% if the boycott wave continues. Marcus closed the report, staring into the void. A familiar feeling welled up inside him, the feeling of isolation in a room full of people. It was the same look he saw in Elijah's eyes the day the boy was forced out of his seat, the feeling of being pushed out, even when you've done nothing wrong. That evening, when Marcus returned home, he found Elijah sitting alone on the sofa, the glow of the television screen reflecting off his face, a face that had grown more mature through days of upheaval. Elijah turned to him, softly asking, "They say you're destroying the company, right?" Marcus gave a tired smile. "Yeah, a lot of people think that. Some just want everything to go back to how it used to be." Elijah nodded slowly. Then he put the remote down, stood up, and faced his father. "You once said I didn't have to speak up. That silence was a kind of protest. But maybe now is the time I need to speak." Marcus stayed silent, his eyes glassy with emotion. Elijah, the same child who had once sobbed in the pressurized cabin, was now the one making a decision no one had asked of him. "If I speak now, I won't just be the kid who got kicked out of his seat. I'll become a symbol. Are you ready for that?" Elijah nodded, without hesitation. The next day, all of America tuned in as Marcus and Elijah appeared on 60 Minutes. Elijah, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, sat upright, his expression composed. No drama, no tears, just the calm of a young man who had lived through more than his years suggested. The interviewer asked, "Elijah, how did it feel when you were asked to leave your first-class seat?" Elijah looked straight into the camera. "At that moment, I felt like I didn't belong there. And the scary thing is, I believed it." The entire studio fell silent. No one dared to breathe. But then I realized if I stayed silent, there would be hundreds of other Elijahs also being kicked out of their seats, out of their dreams, out of their futures. I don't want to be the one who stays silent anymore. In the final segment of the interview, Marcus announced a bold new plan. Establishing an independent oversight board comprised of individuals who had experienced discrimination, with direct power to intervene in company policy. The conservative right screamed in protest. But this time something had changed. More moderate shareholders began returning to Marcus's side. They saw the rising tide of young consumers, minority voices, and ethical allies ready to support Skyline because of the values the company was now committed to. That night, a video went viral across social media. A Skyline flight was shown taking off, and on the cabin screen appeared the message, "This flight honors Elijah Monroe Walker, the boy who stood up even when he was told to sit down." Applause echoed through the cabin. One passenger whispered, "We're flying with the new Skyline. This isn't just an airline anymore. It's a new beginning." The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a sharp blade slicing through the tension in the air. All eyes turned toward the person who had just entered. Not a lawyer, not a judge, but Chancellor Elena Rousseau, director of the Federal Aviation Investigation Bureau, a figure who had never appeared in any public hearing before. Her presence sent reporters into a frenzy, cameras flashing rapidly, whispers rising like crashing waves. Elena walked straight to the witness stand. Without pleasantries, she opened a folder and looked directly at the board members. Our independent investigation has confirmed that Marjorie Holloway was unlawfully removed from her first-class seat solely based on racial prejudice and personal bias from both the security officer and the lead flight attendant, Diane Mercer. And more seriously, Atlantic Eagle Airlines actively covered up this fact. The courtroom went dead silent. Diane Mercer, who had remained confidently cold throughout the earlier hearings, now lowered her head, her hands trembling beneath the table. The defense attorney tried to intervene, but Elena Rousseau didn't allow a word in. As the federal oversight agency, we've ordered a full investigation into Atlantic Eagle's staffing, training, and internal complaint procedures. The results are staggering. More than 87% of discrimination complaints were never processed correctly, and in many cases the complainants were placed on no-fly lists. It was the final blow. People turned to each other in shock. Then, the applause began, first by one person, then by the entire audience, row by row. A wave of empathy and indignation turned into unstoppable applause. Marjorie, sitting beside her parents, couldn't hold back her tears. This was no longer about personal revenge. This was recognition. This was justice restored. Court and community response. Just hours after the verdict was delivered, a 60-day suspension of Atlantic Eagle's operating license, a $750 million fine, and a mandated overhaul of its senior HR leadership. A video clip of Marjorie's press conference speech went viral. She stood at the podium, her voice slow yet weighted with meaning. "I don't want anyone to ever feel what I felt. Being pulled out of a seat not because you were wrong, but because someone else couldn't believe you deserved to be there. I forgive, but I do not forget. And I won't stop until every black child can sit in any seat without fearing that they'll be questioned for it." The hashtag number I deserve this seat became a global trend within just 2 hours. Millions shared Marjorie's story, not just because she was a victim, but because she had turned pain into action, and action into a symbol of hope and change. Legacy and real change. 3 months after the trial, a quiet but powerful event took place. The Marjorie Holloway Equality Grant was established by a group of anonymous donors, among them the recently ousted CEO of Atlantic Eagle. The scholarship supports black students studying aviation, law, and human resources management, the very fields that shape the structures of fairness in our future. Diane Mercer, the former lead flight attendant, publicly apologized in a special interview. But there was no applause for her. She understood. Atonement doesn't come from words. It comes from how you choose to live after losing your power. In her final appearance, she said, "I was wrong. Not because Marjorie became influential, but because I failed to see her as a human being with worth. I just hope people like me learn this lesson before it's too late. Have you ever looked at someone and in a split second decided they didn't belong? Are you willing to question the bias that might live quietly inside you? And if tomorrow you witness injustice unfolding before your eyes, will you stay silent, or will you speak?" Message and real-life lessons from the story. 1. Prejudice is invisible, but its consequences are painfully real. What happened to Marjorie being pulled from her first-class seat was not a misunderstanding. It was an act born from unconscious bias, a deeply rooted mindset that many have accepted as normal. But that very normalcy causes deep harm, making innocent people feel they don't belong in spaces they have every right to occupy. Lesson: every action, every glance, every decision, no matter how small, can be tainted by bias if we don't stay aware and mindful. Justice isn't about treating everyone the same. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves the same respect. 2. Strength doesn't lie in shouting. It lies in silent resilience. Marjorie didn't shout. She didn't film a video, didn't retaliate, didn't scream. She stayed silent, but it was a silence full of dignity, a silence that forced the world to stop and look again. And it was that calm strength that carried her story far beyond the reach of temporary outrage. Lesson. In a noisy world, sometimes the right silence can shake an entire system. What matters isn't how loudly you speak, it's the value of what you stand for. 3. Real change begins with action, not just an apology. Diane Mercer apologized. Atlantic Eagle offered compensation. But if things had stopped there, this story would have lost its meaning. What truly mattered was that Marjorie chose to continue, not to seek revenge, but to rebuild. The scholarship, the reforms, the collective voices that rose, those are signs of lasting change. Lesson. Forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. An apology only holds value when it's followed by real corrective action. 4. You're either part of the solution or part of the problem. From the security guard, the flight attendant, to the passengers near Marjorie that day, no one spoke up. They chose silence, perhaps out of fear, discomfort, or the belief that it's not my business. But silence is a choice, and sometimes that silence helps injustice survive. Lesson. If you witness something wrong and do nothing, you're making room for it to keep happening. Courage isn't about grand gestures, it's about saying no at the right moment. 5. Justice doesn't descend from above, it's built by everyday people. In the end, justice in this story didn't come from a judge or a powerful executive. It came from a young girl, a family that refused to back down, a community that dared to question, and people brave enough to break the cycle of indifference. Lesson. Each of us has the right and the responsibility to be a part of justice. No one is too small to make a difference. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you believe that fairness, humanity, and dignity are essential to any civilized society, please like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you won't miss more stories that restore our faith and justice in one another.